Hey guys, I think it's just fantastic when you can get great photographs at live events. But as a photographer, it's a little bit challenging to do. So I'd like to share with you my camera settings and a few tips to help you get really great photographs of performers on stage under stage lighting. Now these days, more people than ever are taking photographs, and most of them are using smartphones to do it. And today's smartphones are really amazing cameras. Some of the images that come out of modern smartphones are so good that even professional photographers have a hard time determining whether or not that picture was taken with a smartphone or a traditional camera. And the phones do this through the use of computational photography. That's where the computer inside of the smartphone analyzes the picture and makes all of the necessary settings and adjustments to the camera to give you the best looking picture in that situation. And in a lot of cases, it does a really good job. Unfortunately, when you're taking photographs of a band on stage, under stage lighting, that's a really unusual lighting situation. And lots of times the phones just don't handle that kind of unusual lighting situation very well. Furthermore, the smartphones use little tiny lenses with little tiny sensors, and an indoor band situation is a very low light environment. And so, since we have very low light to work with, using a little tiny lens that doesn't gather much light is probably not your best choice. So for these reasons, I would stay away from using a smartphone to photograph a live band. Now, if you have to use a smartphone to photograph a live band, for many phones there are apps available that you can install on the phone that will allow you to manually control the camera settings. And that would give you a little edge up over just letting the phone do its thing automatically. And I'd suggest looking into that. But if I had a choice, I would use a traditional camera, not a smartphone. Try to find a traditional camera like this one here, which is a DSLR. You could use the DSLR or mirrorless camera. Really, any kind of camera would be good as long as you have the ability to manually set the camera for manual exposure so that you're in control rather than the machine. I would also choose a camera, if I could, that has the ability to use interchangeable lenses. So a mirrorless camera or a DSLR that you can change the lenses out on would be your best bet. Now, our human eye is pretty amazing. We can walk out to a sunny beach and see clearly, and then we can walk into a dimly lit bar and also see clearly, even though there's a huge range of difference in the amount of lighting in that scene. But a camera and its sensor, not so much. In order for the camera to work well, we have to get the amount of light coming into the sensor to be regulated to a very narrow range where the sensor operates well. If we let too much light in, our photo is going to look all washed out. If we let not enough light in, the photo is going to be too dark and we'll lose all the detail. So we need to control just exactly how much light's coming into the camera so we get a properly exposed image. To do this, we have three controls we can adjust. We can adjust the shutter speed, we can adjust the f-stop, which is how much light comes through the lens, and we can adjust the ISO. And the ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor inside of the camera. Let's break this down a little bit in more detail. With the shutter speed, we control how long we let light to come passing into the camera to expose that image. And if the shutter speed is too fast, we won't let enough light in and the image will be too dark. If the shutter speed is open for too long, well, the image will be too light. But also, we need to adjust the shutter speed so that we can freeze the action of the performer. If our shutter speed is too slow, the shutter will be open while the performer is moving around and we'll get a blurry image. And like I said, if it's too fast, we just won't let enough light in, and so we won't be able to get a properly exposed photograph. I set my shutter speed to between 1/100th of a second and 1/200th of a second, usually around the middle of that at like 1/160th of a second. If the performer isn't moving around very much, you can probably go as slow as 1/100th of a second to capture the action. And at that speed, you might see just a little bit of motion blur on things like their hand if they're strumming a guitar. And that may be a good thing for artistic effect, or maybe not. If the performer's moving around more quickly, like for example a drummer, 1/200th of a second is probably a better choice. But I usually start out at about 1/160th of a second. The next thing that we can control is the aperture, or the f-stop number. And this is determined by the lens in your camera as to how much it will open up. This is, if you will, a set of shutters on the lens that control how much light is allowed to pass through the lens. And very high numbers like f16 or f22 or higher mean that we've stopped the lens way down and we're only letting just a little pinhole of light pass through the lens. On the other end of the scale, if we open the lens up to f3.5 or lower, that means that we're letting a lot more light come through the lens. And this is a series of mechanical vanes or shutters inside of the lens that just allow more or less light to pass through the glass. In this case, we know we're dealing with a very low light situation, and so we want a lens that will allow us to have a low f-stop number. And on this camera, I've replaced the lens that comes with the camera with this Canon 50mm lens, which is not a really expensive lens, but it does have an f-stop rating of 1.8, which is a pretty wide open lens. You can spend more money and get even brighter lenses that have lower f numbers than that, but the lens that came with this camera was f3.5. And so this lens that's on here right now will allow more light to come through than the original lens will, and I'll fare better in really low light situations. So you want to seek out a lens that will give you the lowest f-stop number possible. And like I say, I'm using a lens here which is f1.8, and that works pretty well for me. Now, one of the things that happens when we adjust our f-stop is if we are stopping down the lens, so we're way up at a high number like f16 or f22, maybe f11, that's not letting very much light through the lens. And so it's probably going to have to be a fairly bright situation for that setting to work well in most cases. But when you are at those higher f-stop numbers, almost everything in frame is going to be in sharp focus. You'll have a very wide depth of field. So your subject will be in focus, and the things behind your subject will be in focus, things in front of them. The whole frame, the whole picture will be in relatively sharp focus. As we start moving down towards those lower f-stop numbers, and we let more and more light come in through the lens, our depth of field will begin to shallow up. And so if I'm using this lens at f1.8, that means that my subject will be in sharp focus, but the things behind me will start to get blurred out, or the things that were in front of me in the frame will also get more blurry. And this can be used to artistic effect to help make your subject stand out in the photo. So by adjusting the f-stop of the lens, we can adjust the depth of field, which is whether or not just our subject is in focus or the whole frame is in focus. But in my case here, when shooting bands on stage, my primary concern is that I need a lot of light to come into the camera so I can get a decent photograph. And so I'm going to set my lens, or set my camera to tell the lens, to go to the lowest f-stop number I have available. And in my case, this one goes down to f1.8. If you spend more money, you could get lenses that could go down to f1.2, 1.4. Generally speaking, as you get into bigger lenses that are more expensive, you'll have the opportunity to go to lower f-stop numbers. And so when shooting bands, I go to the lowest f-stop setting I can on my camera. Now the third thing that we can adjust is the ISO, or this is the sensitivity of the camera to light. And this is somewhat like a microphone preamp in that I can turn the sensitivity way up, but when I do so, I get hum and hiss and noise in the background. Same thing with the camera. If I turn that ISO factor way high, then I'll start to see noisy backgrounds in the pictures and somewhat less distinct images. So my goal is to keep the ISO number as low as possible. And of course it varies camera to camera as to how high you can go with that ISO number before the images start to degrade to an unacceptable degree. Typically, I like to use ISO numbers of between 100 and 400 for really high quality images, but might have to compromise in a really low light situation and use a little higher ISO numbers in order to get the exposure that we need. So what I do is I set my shutter speed to 1/160th or thereabouts, plus or minus, I open my lens all the way wide to f1.8, or as low as you can go with your camera, and then I tell the camera to use an automatic ISO setting. So it's going to automatically adjust the sensitivity of the sensor inside of the camera as needed in order to get a properly exposed photograph with my other settings set to 1/160th of a second and f1.8 in my case. And I'll let the camera do the metering and light control that way. The other settings that I choose in the camera is I do spot metering. So normally the camera looks at the entire image and determines how much light it should allow to come in based upon kind of the average of everything that it sees across the entire frame of the picture. But when I'm shooting photographs of performers on stage, I know that there's some real hot spots of light behind them, and it's not a really evenly lit environment. I'm concerned about getting the face of the performer properly exposed, and the rest of the scene I'll just let do what it's going to do. But I want to make sure that the performer themselves are in tight focus and proper exposure. So I will use spot exposure so that only the very center of the frame, that one little point, is what the camera is looking at in order to determine what its exposure factor should be. Likewise, for focus, I want to use spot focus, so only the very little center dot inside of the frame is what the camera is going to lock in on for focus. And so with my camera, and I think it's pretty typical with most cameras, when you push the shutter button down to take the photo, it's kind of a two-step button. The first half of a press will get the camera turned on and locked in, and it will try to set the proper exposure and lock in the focus for the photograph. And since I'm using spot exposure and spot focus, it's going to only pay attention to the very center of the picture frame. So I aim the camera at the performer and put them in the very center of the frame. So I'll aim the very center of the frame at their face, for example, and then I push the button for the trigger halfway down and allow the camera to lock in and get focus. And as soon as that happens, then I will move the camera around as necessary to frame the picture the way that I like, and perhaps I'll put the performer a little bit off-center, depending upon the composition that I'm going for. But the camera will remember the exposure and focus setting because I'm still holding the button halfway down. So I just pressed halfway down and I hold. I reframe the picture as I desire, and then when I see the performer get into just exactly the right pose, I push the trigger the rest of the way and snap the photograph. What I will often do is I'll set my camera into burst mode. So as long as I hold the shutter button down, the camera will continuously take photos, maybe 5 photos per second or more. In the world of digital photography, I don't have any problem with just taking a lot of pictures and throwing away the bad ones. It's not like film where I'm actually paying money for each shot I take. As long as I have available memory, I can keep shooting photos, and it doesn't bother me if I have to shoot 20 photos to get one that's good. So when the performer is in a position where I think they're going to give me a good expression, I'll just hold down the button and start shooting off frames. And I might do that for a couple of seconds to get a whole bunch of frames of them in that particular position. And hopefully one of them, or two, or more, will work out just fine. Now a couple of other tips. Before I take the photograph, I look around the perimeter of my frame, and I make sure that there's nothing protruding into my frame that I don't want to see, anything getting cut off, anything that is along the outside frame of the picture that is distracting or doesn't fit well into my composition. So I try not to get myself into a position where I'm just have tunnel vision looking at just the performer. I try to scan around the entire frame to make sure that there's nothing in there that's going to be distracting or out of balance or out of place before I hit the trigger on the camera. And the other thing that I keep in mind is the rule of thirds. And this is just a guideline. Photography is art, and so all of these things are just simply guidelines, and it's always okay to push things a little bit one way or another in the name of art and creativity. But a common suggestion is to cut up your frame into a tic-tac-toe type checkerboard with 2 cuts horizontal and 2 cuts vertical, each one of them slicing about 1/3 of the frame. And then put your subject or things of interest into those corners where the frame intersects. So this puts your subject a little bit off to the side, a little off balance, and usually that provides for a better balanced photograph. Of course, if my performer is off to the side a little bit, I try to have some content over here to balance out the whole picture as well. Well, folks, those are some tips for you. I hope that it helps you get your camera settings dialed in so that you can take really good-looking photographs of your performers up on stage. And beyond that, it's a matter of artistic creativity, and practice helps a lot, of course. So go out there and take a bunch of photos, and with practice, I'm sure you'll get some really great ones. And hope you end up with some material for your band that you can use for promotional activities and to remind you of some of the really fantastic memories you've had along the way and along the journey with your band. My name is Barry. I'm a sound engineer in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and part-time photographer. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like any help with your band, either sound or photography, and you're in the area, I'd love to help you out. So hit me up and we'll make it happen. Love to hear your comments. And I would also appreciate it if you'd help the channel grow by hitting the subscribe button, hitting the notification button so that YouTube will notify you of fresh new content when it's available. If you'd like to thumb up the video, that would be cool. And I hope to see you again on another episode of Sound Advice.